Today I wanted to talk a little bit about desktop environments, also Window Manager. In order to do that, we need to go back a little bit and talk about the history of graphical user interfaces, and more importantly, graphical and capable devices. So the University of Illinois had PLATO, which they invented in 1960, and that became PLATO 4 in 1971. Of course, the difference between the one in 1960 and 71 is they actually had plasma displays in the later models in order to be able to draw graphical elements on the screen. From Xerox, they had their Alto in 1973 and their Star in 1981. That actually was the first time where we had desktop environments that were actually available, but they were very expensive. Apollo Computer, they came out with their display manager in 1981, about the same time as the Star. But it wasn't really popularized until Apple came out with the Lisa in 1983 and followed that with the Macintosh in 1984. That is really when people took interest in graphical user interfaces for the first time. The Unix world had the Andrew project in 1982 and Rob Pike's Blit terminal in 1982 as well. So those were really the beginnings of being able to do things. But the graphical user interface in those environments had to be built in the software and on the hardware. They weren't transportable. So yeah, they were married. So if you wanted to be able to use whatever you developed on the Xerox Star, you pretty much were stuck. You couldn't go anywhere. So the MIT wanted to build one that was transportable from one machine to the next. So they were working on something called X Windows. Well, where did X, how did they come up with that name? Well, as it turns out, it's a little bit like the C language derived its name. So if you know the story, C derived its name from B, which was the predecessor to the C language. X Windows is similar. It drew its name from its successor in 1983, which was called W. So that, of course, is the letter preceding X in the English alphabet. But W ran under the V operating system. So, if you're probably wondering why B, C, then you had X, W, and V. Yeah, programmers, I guess they just wanted to use the single characters to identify what projects they were working on back then. But W used the network protocol that supported terminals and graphical windows, with the server being used to maintain display lists. So, and that's basically what X does in all forms of it. So you could take your keyboard, your mouse, and your screen, and you could plug it into your X server, and then your X clients, like a browser or an Xterm session. There's X clock, there's X fonts, there's a whole bunch of applications on the X client side that communicate with that X server and then respond based on how you use your keyboard, move your mouse, and what elements are displayed on the screen. But further, X Windows also works across a network, so X clients can also be external. They can be across the country, around the world, and they will still work. We have a Windows manager and we have this thing called desktop environments. What are they? What's the difference between them? Well, Windows managers were the first means to create graphical user interfaces, and they could only control the placement of windows, change the active window from another window, or moving the windows around the display, or creating a window, destroying a window. Yeah, so they're very primitive in their inner workings. You cannot launch an application with the Windows Manager. So there was a number of window managers under X. The first one was TWM, and that was, I think it was called Tabbed Window Manager or Tom's Window Manager originally. That was released in 1984, and that became the de facto window manager for X11. But there were some other ones. There was UWM, which was the Ultrix window manager, which was the only compatible X11R1 window manager that was released. And that was released in 1985. So that was really meant for Ultrix. That would be DEC's version of Unix. However, there was 2 additional window managers that were shipped along with the X Window system. So if you went to download the source code, you got XWM for free. XWM was very primitive. I mean, it didn't have the bells or whistles that TWM had. And TWM is still maintained, and if you really want to put it up on your flavor of Linux, you can certainly do that, and you can find out just how bad things can be. No, I'm kidding. Read the manual first before you use it, otherwise you might get stuck just trying to figure out how to close the window you just created. There's also XNWM, which was the next generation of XWM that came along. Those were the window managers that shipped with X10 release 3. So that preceded the X11 versions that we all know about today. So what makes a desktop environment? That is really a bundle of software components, and a desktop environment provides a common graphical user interface. So it is responsible for maintaining a look and feel that goes across all the applications that are running. But a good desktop environment includes icons and toolbars, window tiles and titlers. You might also find wallpapers and desktop widgets. There's a lot more applications you'll find. It may include software that allows you to install graphical applications, to be able to launch those applications, even remove them when you don't want them anymore. And you don't have to use a terminal interface to do it. And the first desktop environment was, of course, the Xerox Alto in 1973, and then popularized by Apple's Macintosh in 1984. So how does this thing look? Let's look at it from the bottom up. You have hardware with your operating system kernel running on top of that. That can either be Linux or FreeBSD or GNU Unix, which is the one that Apple uses. And then you have your display server and your window manager. So your display servers, that can be your Xorg server, it can be Weston, and then you have your window manager. That could be things like Awesome, or it can be Compiz, or it can be OpenBox, things like that. And then there's an interface between the display server and the graphical interface. That would be your X11, Wayland, etc. That would be up there. But the graphical elements, or the graphical interface itself, that would be your desktop environment. That would be something like KDE or GNOME or even Aqua on the Mac would all fit it, because even though the Mac uses a version of X11 called Xquark, which is basically rewritten, that is still I hear people say all the time that the Mac is a closed environment, but parts of it are not. And Xquartz is still maintained as open source. Then above that, you have user. And that would be where you would plug in your device and be able to access applications through the display manager. So which is better? I mean, if you look at desktop environments or window managers, which would you pick? Well, that depends. I mean, just like everything else in the world, it depends on what you want to do. A desktop environment is the most complete graphical user interface that you can get. Every DE, however, also comes with a window manager under it. So a window manager offers more customization. Perhaps it has a lower memory footprint and a lower processor footprint. But, as you add on tools to compensate for the deficiencies of a window manager, you're going to find that the memory footprint will rapidly start to approach what a desktop environment would take. So, in most window managers, however, in order to do the customization, that requires knowledge of programming in most aspects. Now, there are some that don't, but there are many that do, and they all use different languages to do that. Some are based on shell. There's some that are based on C. There's some that are based on Tickle, and there's some that are based on esoteric programming languages as well. So, yeah, if that's something of interest to you, then hey, go. I mean, that's fine. I mean, for me, because window managers were first that I learned, I consider them archaic and a thing of the past. However, you may find them a great way to manage your system or a way to learn about Linux. And I'm not knocking them. I'm just saying for me, that's water over the dam, and no thank you. I don't need to go back and learn history. On the desktop environments in Linux, how many are there? Well, the K desktop environment was actually the first in the Linux world for building a desktop environment. That was released in 1996. GNOME came along a year later in 1997. Xfce was founded in 1996, but I think they released about the same time as GNOME. LXDE was started in 2006, and of course, there's other ones that have gone down the path since then. So why is GNOME the default DE on so many Linux distros? I mean, given the number of people, I mean, it seems like you read more about people that hate GNOME than people that like it. So, but I think it's more of they're just more vocal. But why is GNOME the default DE on so many large distros? Well, GNOME was popularized by Red Hat, and Red Hat had a significant stake in its development, and they still do. And then many of the distros kind of followed suit. You had, of course, Fedora, which is part of Red Hat. Ubuntu and Debian and a bunch of others all chose GNOME because it offered better support than the other distros. So why didn't they choose KDE? It was first, right? Why didn't they all pick that? Well, in the beginning, KDE had some problems. It was popular, but it had a proprietary licensing of some of its key development components that stopped it right in its tracks from becoming more widely used. So are those problems gone? Are those fixed today? Does it have those still? Sadly not. They have improved it somewhat, but there are still proprietary licensing in KDE even today with some of the components. So why was that an issue back in 1996? Well, if you look at your history, that was the start of the Unix lawsuits. And a lot of people, including those that were in Linux, were a little gun shy because there was literally lawyers coming out of the woodwork and everybody was suing everybody. And so Linux was trying to stay out of the fray and not aggravate it by having proprietary licensing of components in their software. So, yeah, I think that was probably one of the chilling effects for using KDE and why you don't. Now, you will find it, of course, on some of as a flagship on some of the distros, but not the big ones. So what do we have? We have GNOME, which is considered the flagship DE of many Linux distros. Then you have Pop! OS Cosmic, which is, they had started out as, there was a Rust-based desktop environment from System 76, and it was based on GDK. However, Pop! OS is removing all of the GNOME and GDK components and basically creating their own, writing their software in Rust to do it. Great. I mean, all power to them. But then you have Xfce. There's a traditional Unix philosophy that it follows. It's highly customizable and has a smaller system footprint. Not my cup of tea, but might be yours. Cinnamon also offers a traditional experience, and it's taken from GNOME 3. By traditional experience, we mean it looks like something like an older version of Windows. You also have Mate, which was a simple desktop which was forked from GNOME 2. Why GNOME 2? Well, when GNOME 3 came out, there was some major changes in the way GNOME worked that a lot of people didn't like. So Mate was born to preserve the older way that GNOME did things. There's also LXQt, which is a lightweight Qt version of a desktop environment, and it is developed as a successor to LXDE. LXDE, of course, it was developed to be fast and energy efficient. So if you're running on a laptop, you may find that LXQT or LXDE might be a better suited desktop environment for you. KDE Plasma, again, it's a familiar work environment. It looks like an older version of Windows can, and it's highly customizable, and that's an understatement. It's so highly customizable that many people can't figure it out, and it's very clean. However, if you spend the time and you learn it, you'll get it. Budgie is a relatively newcomer to the desktop environments. It also uses GTK components. It was initially developed for the Evolve OS, which later became Solus. Now, I do have Enlightenment included on my list of desktop environments, and you may say, oh wait, Enlightenment is a window manager. I agree. However, you can turn Enlightenment into a desktop environment, and let me tell you how you do that. So it is a composting window manager. It also can be a Wayland composter. It's known by many as the eye candy window manager. But when you use it with Enlightenment Foundation libraries, the EFL, it can be a full desktop environment all by itself. Pantheon is a desktop environment for elementary OS. It was written from scratch using a product called Vala. You also have the Trinity desktop that preserves the older KDE 3.5 design style. And then you have something called Sugar, which was a desktop environment that was designed for children 5 to 12 years old. It's designed for them to learn how to use a graphical desktop environment without the tiny controls that we're used to. So you have bigger controls and larger movements that a child would be using at that age. So you also have Common Desktop Environments, which is a desktop environment that came from Unix originally. So why did Common Desktop Environment exist? Why did that come about? Well, because at that time, AT&T and Sun had developed OpenLook, and that was their unified desktop environment for Unix. Well, because IBM and HP and DEC and all the rest were concerned that would mean that this would be basically the largest hardware vendor and the largest software vendor that would be in the market and controlling every aspect of Unix. And so they didn't want that. So they developed Motif, which was the API upon which the Common Desktop Environment was built, and released that for both Unix and VMS, later OpenVMS. So, in fact, Sun adopted the Common Desktop Environment later and started to use it on their workstation. There's also EDE, which is the Equinox Desktop Environment. It's just a simple, lightweight, and fast one. You're probably going to notice a theme with some of these being lightweight, fast. That seems to be the main reason why people will fork an existing desktop environment and develop a new one. You also have UKUI, or UKUI. That is a lightweight based on a pluggable framework for Linux. It is a part of the Ubuntu version for the Chinese government that is marketed in China, and that is the desktop environment that is used with that. You also have Lumina Desktop. That's a lightweight DE that's written in Qt 5, and that runs on FreeBSD. Lumina includes Fluxbox as its window manager, and Fluxbox is another standalone window manager that you will find available for Linux as well. There's also UDE, or the Unix Desktop Environment. There is a conflict in that name, and in fact there's also the UWM, which is the Unix Window Manager, that they use that name again, but don't confuse the two. The Unix Desktop Environment and their version of the window manager is nothing like the one that was on Unix. In fact, it is a completely different desktop environment, a completely new graphical user interface that has no taskbar, there's no desktop panel, there's no Windows title bar, there's no way to close a window, no way to resize the window on the screen, and instead they replace all of that with what they call the hex menu. It is so different. But I don't know if they're still actively developing on it. They might be. And then there's GNUStep. GNUStep was an advanced, well, in fact, it still is. I mean, they are actively developing it. It is an advanced GUI design suited for both desktop and server application that closely follows Apple's Coca and NextStep or OpenSTEP, which is more portable to a variety, but it's more portable to a variety of platforms and architectures. There's also various KDE incantations that are based on older versions that are still maintained, as well as some that are based on GNOME. So yeah, you have. I mean, here's my comment on all of this. If you were to go out to all of the repositories for every one of these, and this is not even a complete list, these are just the ones that I can think of. So if you have more, please add them. First, please add them to the comments below. But the point I'm trying to make here is if you went out and you looked at all the lines of code and the costs associated with maintaining and building every one of those, what would happen if we had taken that same effort, that same amount of money, and had put it into 1 or 2 desktop environments instead of, what? How many desktop environments are there? Maybe 20, maybe 25 of them. So what would happen? Where would we be if we, instead of splintering ourselves off into 16 different directions that are here, what would happen if we concentrated our effort on 1 or 2? I mean, literally, when we get to window managers, there are so many window managers that even Baskin Robbins doesn't have as many flavors as the window manager crews do. It seems like every time somebody sneezes, there's a new window manager that pops up. Yeah, there's a lot more, and next time we'll talk more about Windows managers, and probably we'll go into depth on some of the desktop environments too. I'm just giving you an overview today. So with that, thanks for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please like and subscribe. Hope to see you all again real soon. Bye for now.